snapping. There's no maybe, there's no close. Things are either snapped to each other in a rigorous way, or they're not. But they're, just because it looks like it's touching, doesn't mean that it is, unless it snaps.
Yes.
Can you go over again real quick? I got those little marks, the lines.
They use the divide command.
No. After that.
Yeah, the red.
It's a polyline.
I'm just drawing a little polyline that snaps to the point. I drew one, and then I'm making a copy that snaps to each of those points.
You mentioned putting those lines or points on a non-print layer. Would you just select that in the layers?
Yes, it did. One of the comments here is to put these marks on a non-print layer. To make a layer non-print, I'm going to scroll over on my Layers tab, and where you see the column that says Plot, there's a little printer. If I click on that printer, there's a little circle with a cross mark next to it. That means that you will always see it in CAD, but when you go to Plot and then Print, it's invisible. Okay? It's a good layer for having things like these little tick marks, or construction lines, or maybe notes for yourself, what have you. Okay? Okay. So that's that next step. Okay? The next one, wouldn't you know it, find a third contour line that's 3 intervals lower than the previous one, call it contour C, divide it into 20 equal segments, and make marks along that polyline. Okay? So this one here, we count 3 down. 1, 2, 3. It's this one. We'll do the wrong one this time. Type divide. Select the object you wish to divide. Enter the number of segments, 20. And then I'm going to temporarily hide that line just by toggling, again, the visibility of that layer. I see a bunch of points along here, so I'll just take the same mark that I've been making and make 19 more copies by snapping to each of these points. My third set of line divisions. Okay. Any questions up to this point? Okay.
So Kevin, I have the, they changed it from D or style to P type, point type.
Huh, okay.
So now, if you select, I always take the crosshairs in the circle, that's it, and make it 5% of screen. Say OK. Whoa.
Visible points.
Instant gratification.
Why would they change the vocabulary?
I have no idea.
So that would be a way of having these points be visible, and because it's sort of relative to the screen size, it's not like they get, bigger or smaller. It gives you something to snap to. They're just getting bigger and bigger the more I zoom in and zoom out, right?
But if you touch RE for regen, they'll go back to their normal 5%.
Yeah, regen kind of is like a redraw method. So you could use this in place of drawing all of those little polylines that snap to each of those points, because now these points are visible throughout the next step. Okay? I'm going to toggle this off though because I have all of those lines. So the next step, we're under generating lines now. We want to create another layer called lines and set that layer color to yellow. Okay? I've got it right here. You click here to create a new layer. You click on the layer name to change the layer name. Click on the swatch to change the layer color. And if I want to make this my active layer in terms of everything that I draw ends up on whatever my active layer happens to be, I double click in this column right here where it says status, that by double clicking right next to the layer you want to make active, we'll make it active. Okay? All right. I'm going to, and then it says draw 2 line segments joining point 1 of contour A with point 1 of contour B, and another line joining point 1 of contour B with point 1 of contour C. So what that looks like is, if I use, let's say polyline, you could start from one end of your topo line or the other. Doesn't matter where you start from, you just have to remain consistent. Okay? So if I start on this far edge over here and I label this point 1, then point 1 of my next contour is the same side. It's the rightmost division of that particular line. Okay? I'm going to end this really quick. So this would be that first part. It's a line between point 1 of contour A and point 1 of contour B. Okay? And then the next part of that is to draw another line segment from point 1 of contour B to point 1 of contour C.
I think it's really important to note how careful Kevin is being. He's finding the end point of his marking line where it intersects with the contour, and he's being exceedingly careful each time, checking, making sure that he's snapped onto that point before he completes the draw line command.
Yes. And then the next part says to continue joining points using lines for point 2 and point 3, etc., connecting all the corresponding points until all 20 points are connected. This will result in 20 V-shaped figures of different angles. Okay? So I've divided those contours into dots, and now I'm connecting the dots. Okay? So I will continue with the polyline command with point 2 of contour A, point 2 of contour B, and point 2 of contour C. Okay? And then the next one. I'm snapping to, as Mitchell said, an endpoint each time, because I know that endpoint corresponds with the marks that I made that are based on the subdivisions of each contour line. Okay.
Oops.
Oh no.
Did I miss it?
Yeah, you missed
Undo.
one.
Oh, you're right. That's sort of a good example of saying that, you know, a lot of these iterations are going to be, you know, very different. Some of them are going to cross over each other. That's fine. They're not all going to be sort of evenly offset from each other.
Quick question real quick. Wait, sorry. I looked back at the intervals. It says 3 intervals. Does that mean 1, 2, 3, or 3 in between?
we're gonna count, it's going to be the third one
The third
down.
one.
The
So
third
way-
line.
Yeah, so
The
if
third line.
this was the one that I divided,
Yeah.
3 below that is 1, 2,
Three.
3.
Okay. Because the first line it said 2.
Yes, the first one is 2. So that's 2 from the, so
So would
I
it
took
be-
my highest point, which is here.
Okay.
2 down from that is 1,
1, 2.
2. Okay. And so from that one it's 1, 2, 3. Okay.
The first one is 2, the next 2 are 3.
Make.
Yeah.
There's a same amount of one.
Just,
Yeah.
you had it for a second there, just don't lose it.
Been cutting cardboard for so long.
So I'd also point out how, Kevin's got this assignment half done right here in real time in front of all of you. And, he's probably working at about 10% of his normal speed because he's demonstrating. So I think this is a really good opportunity for everybody to kind of practice or kind of AutoCAD chops. But also, this should not be a terribly time-intensive process.
Also, I don't have a lot of mouse space over here.
Yay.
Feel free to chime in as I'm doing this.
So how long did it take you to become a CAD master?
What?
I said, how long did it take you to become the CAD master?
I would hardly call myself a CAD master, but I first started using AutoCAD before we used mice to use AutoCAD. That was my first introduction to CAD. The first class I took was in 2006. However long ago that's been. And then
I think my first one was 2003, 2004. So.
1990. God help me.
My phone ran out of storage.
So as Kevin's completing this, the first job that I worked on that was produced in AutoCAD, I started working on in 1990, which was the what's now known as the Bibliothèque Mitterrand in Paris, the National Library of France, and that project was done immediately after the Opera of the Bastille, which was the last project done by hand for a kind of large institutional project in France. And it was 1/4 the size of the library. The opera was 25% the size of the library. For the opera, they had a drafting room staff alone of 110 people. And with AutoCAD 10, 1990, the drafting staff was 30 people for a building 4 times bigger.
So did the hand drafters manage to convert to the software? Or did you just...
One would hope. But what really happened was that they hired a lot of young people, because at that time I was young. We just replaced. I'm gonna say mostly old guys who would sit there and smoke Gauloise over their drafting boards. And
Don't ash on the paper.
well, you can do it that way if you want, kid. But let me tell you, when we did the Concorde,
Is that what they told you?
you know what? Just as another side, when they did draw the Concorde, I'm getting all this on tape, right? They drafted the wings of the Concorde at real scale.
Oh,
True story.
Wow.
In a giant hangar down in Bordeaux. They laid out drawings that were 1-to-1 scale and drew the wings of that aircraft before they manufactured.
That's so cool.
And that, isn't it? I've seen pictures of them doing it.
Do you know how long it took?
I have no idea.
Do they use those chalk lines instead of?
No,
a ruler?
they drew it on Mylar.
Biggest French curve in the world.
That's right.
Yeah.
Probably the background.
Okay. So, I now have 20.
Listen up!
I now have 20 roughly V-shaped lines, just as the directions told me I would. And then it's asking me to extend each of these line segments away from the vertex, we'll call the vertex just the middle of the V, until it hits a side of the square, okay? So, with the extend command, I'm selecting the square, which should be a single closed polyline. I'm selecting that as my boundary, and then I'm going to type in extend. The first object I select is my boundary. And then every other object I click on is extending that to that boundary. Okay, so if I click here, it extends that line. That line gets extended. That line gets extended. And you don't have to click on them one at a time. If you're careful, you can use crossing windows. Remember, if we select right to left, everything that intersects that window will be selected. Okay? And every time, it's just shooting off to this boundary here. Okay?
I think one got skipped up top, right in the middle. That one. Bingo.
That's crazy.
Got them all, sorry.
Okay. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. We want both sides of these to extend. Okay. This is my boundary, and then I can select multiple objects at a time to make sure that they're all extending to my selected boundary. Okay. The next step, this is under making a mark. We're going to create a layer called acute and set the layer color to cyan. So I have a layer here called acute, set to cyan. And I'm going to then find the V shape that has the most acute angle and change its layer to acute. Okay? Everyone remember what acute means?
Yep.
What does acute mean, Lua?
Isn't it just like almost like a 45? No, it's not. I forgot.
Less
To be
than
honest.
45 degrees.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, but in this context, it's the smallest angle. Okay? So the way that you can check how much each of these lines measures in between each other is if you go to your oh, it's already open. Where did I change it to? What happened? Oh, annotate. I'm sorry. First tab. Switch to the annotate tab, and then under dimension, switch it to angular. Okay. The shortcut command for that, if you'd rather type that in, is DIM angular. So when I enable that, if I click between two lines, okay, I get a little measurement here, a little arc inscribed between that angle. I can't read it. If I zoom in, I can see that it measures 172. But what I can do is change the properties of this individual measurement and make the text just larger to where I can read it without having to zoom in every single time. So how about 5? Maybe a little bigger. 10. Okay, that works for me. So you can do that for every single V-shaped line and then just pick the smallest number, or you could sort of eliminate these very obtuse angles. I'd recommend maybe just going through and measuring every single one, probably good practice. So between this line and this line, here, we can see that that's still small, so I can use the match properties command.
This is a really good command to know.
That's my favorite.
Match prop is going to ask for a source object, which is going to be this this angle that I've changed the text size of. And now my destination object is going to be every other angular dimension that I have that I want to have the same text size. Okay? And I can do that as many times as like objects as I have. You can do that for lines that perhaps you want to match properties of a layer. You can use that for dimensions that you want to match dimension style properties to. It's infinitely useful. Okay? So I'm going to go through and I'm going to put an angle at each of these intersections and then make the text large enough for us to see. Okay? I'll do it as quickly as possible. Source object, target object, 151, that's our lowest so far. 4, 7. Okay. So, 151 was my smallest angle measurement, and I'm going to put that on the acute layer per the instructions. Okay, so if I select that object under layer properties, I can change it from lines to acute. I know it's on the right layer because it's displayed as the right color. Okay. Questions about measuring the angle between two lines?
Dim angular.
Sorry?
You said it was dim angular?
Yes.
Yeah.
Or if you're a button clicker, annotate, change this drop down from linear to angular, and then you can click right here.
Okay.
turn off the lines layer so you're just left with the one acute angle. Okay, so if I go here, go to my lines layer, you never want to turn off a layer that is your active layer. So I'm going to switch to the acute layer by making that my active layer, and then toggling off the lines layer. So all that I'm left with is my most acute measured line. Okay? This line represents the center line of an 80-foot wide by 80-foot deep channel to be inscribed in the ground of your site model. Okay? So before I move on to the next step, it doesn't explicitly say so, but if that line represents a center line, I probably want lines that define the overall width of this 80-foot wide channel. Okay? What command can I use? Offset, good. What is my offset distance going to be? 40 feet. You guys are smart.
Just said 80.
I'm going to offset, specify my offset distance as 40 feet. Oops. I'm not in architectural, so I'll just type in 40.
We should probably, could we take a break right there and just say, so if Kevin types units right now, you will see that he is working, well, I'll let you say it.
I'm working in decimal feet. That's going to make ultimately the conversion and working with an engineering scale a lot simpler. But the reason why when I put in the foot apostrophe mark to define 40 feet, it got mad at me and spat it back because it wants its measurements in a decimal format referencing feet as the units. So if I type 40, it gives me 40 feet. If I type 10, it gives me 10 feet. If I type 0.5, it gives me 6 inches.
So if, for example, you were working in architectural and inches, which would be the kind of default mode of working for something the size of your 25 by 25 foot campus fragment, Kevin, if you wanted 40 feet, would have to type the feet symbol after the 40, otherwise it would give him 40 inches.
Yes.
So it's always a good idea, even though they're going to open a template file that they've already been given, is that correct? It would be a very good kind of standard practice to just, before you do anything, like you would in Rhino, type units. Make sure that your units are set up for this project in decimal feet.
It should be, but yes,
But,
double check.
but it's always, like that's just something you would do before you put hours of work into
Yeah.
anything. You would check the units. Sorry.
No, that's good. That's good. Thank you. So I will go back to offset. My distance is 40. I select the object I want to offset, which is the center line, and I move my mouse in the direction I wish to offset. I need to do both sides, so I move my mouse this way. I select the center line again. I move my mouse this way. Okay? So now I have a center line and the actual outline that represents an 80-foot wide channel. Okay? What you should do is each of these offsets, those should also be extended to the boundary or trimmed by the boundary, depending on whether it's inside or outside. Okay? So I can use the extend command. Oops, typo. Extend. This is my boundary. I'm going to extend this line to it, but I'm I'm going to use the trim command to trim this part of the line that extends beyond it. Okay? I'll do the same thing on the other side. Okay? And I'm zooming way in because the extension or the miss is more subtle. But I wanna
Can
make
zoom out just again.
Yeah.
Can you see, this is a perfect example. Those lines look like they're touching the border, right? But when he zooms in, you can see that one extends past it and one is short. That's a perfect example of that snapping issue. If you don't snap to and from specific points, this is what will happen. Your drawing will look okay, but it won't be okay.
Mhm.
Yeah. So again, I'll trim the one that extends beyond and extend the one that falls short. Okay. There's our most acute line, offset by 40 feet on either side. Okay? This is the most complicated step of all, and we'll probably spend a lot of time talking about how to do this. But it says to create this channel, pull your contour lines towards the higher elevation 2 levels upward, 2 thicknesses of cardboard. So let me back up for a second. Each of these contour lines represents a 40-foot elevation change. Right? Does that sound familiar? I said that? Okay. How many lines would represent an 80-foot elevation change? 2. Why do I care about 80 feet?
Because it says to move the or pull your contour lines toward the higher elevation. So you want to pull it back.
Serena said, because you want to pull your contour up 2 contour increments up slope. Did I quote you properly?
Yeah, sorry, I mumbled.
I have that teacher's voice.
That's also related to another dimension that's given to us on the assignment sheet. The 80-foot depth of the channel. Okay? Depth, another way of saying that is elevation change. So if I need 2 lines to represent an 80-foot elevation change, that's where that interaction comes in. If I want to display, and it's not going to be super clear in plan moving forward, maybe later in the week or sort of depending on schedule, we'll be able to see how this manifests in 3 dimensions, okay? But for now, we're doing this in plan. And the way that you do this is, let's say I started with this line here. You want to interact with every single topo line that intersects this channel. Okay, even this one over here. I don't care about these ones over here because they're not playing with the channel. Okay. The way that we redraw these topo lines, that's exactly what's happening. We're redrawing. This line here represents a consistent elevation. Is that the 4800? No, that's the 40. That's 4720. Okay. So this line keeps cruising along, and then whoops, it intersects where this channel goes, and immediately this line needs to be represented at 80 feet deep. Okay. So the way that I have to redraw this line is at this point, at this intersection, I'm going to, I'll do it right here with a polyline command. At this intersection, see that cross that pops up and the little tooltip says intersection? I know that I'm snapping to the right point because that's where I want to start. I will click, and then moving uphill.
Hit F8. Oh, there you go.
1, 2 topo lines. Okay? I click there again because that's where that's where the next intersection goes. Okay, so I click there. And then, what's nice about these topo lines is they're sort of, they're line based, not spline based. So I have points along each of these topo lines that I can snap to directly trace. And I want to snap to endpoints, okay? So if it's not super clear, you can kind of drag your cursor until you see an endpoint, click, and I'm starting to trace this topo line that's running across the bottom of the channel. And I'm gonna go again until I get that next endpoint. Okay, I've traced that portion of the topo line. And now I only have to go until it intersects again with the edge of the channel, because then at this point, it's going to run up the opposite side of the channel and keep going until it intersects with that same topo line on that I started with. Okay, so I started with this one, went up 2 lines, came over, went back down, and now it intersects here. And at that point, it's going to continue off into the end of the channel, or it extends off this square, but it will continue on to your neighbor's square. Okay. So, for example, if how can we do this? I will take that line that I drew. I'm going to put it on a different layer. Does it tell us what kind of layer we should put it on? No.
But it should.
It should.
So amend the instructions.
We can call this pulled topo. Okay. I will give this let's give it a green color. We haven't used green yet. Okay. So then if I, oops. Put it on that layer. Put it on the full topo layer. And to make it super clear what's happening, I'm going to turn off the acute layer. And just temporarily, I'm going to, well, not temporarily, because what you want to do now is this new line that you've drawn, you want to join it with the original topo line that it came from. Okay? And I think there's a couple of ways you want to think about doing this. One is that there is some point further off into this channel, since it extends to the end, where this part of this topo line represents an 80-foot depth that comes from somewhere else downhill. You're not creating that topo line, but that topo line will manifest on your model. Okay? So I don't exactly want to delete that line, because I want to be able to reference it for completing this process for every single topo line. Okay? And I want to be able to continue this methodology all the way through uphill and into this channel. Okay? To where this line no longer represents this elevation, it represents 80 feet below, which corresponds to 2 topo line intersections downhill from your channel. Okay?
Could we trim that out and just turn that whole level green and match properties? I think it'll, so what we've done is we've regraded the site now.
Okay?
And the new grading looks like this.
So that's what that line does. And then if I do it with the next one, I lose that intersection, and so on, and so on, and so on.
How come you trimmed that line right there? That was in the middle of the 2 lines.
Because when, I'll let Kevin
No,
answer.
go ahead.
I was just, well, so this line represents 4720.
Yeah.
okay? But who asked the question again?
Over here.
So watch. So this is 4720 as it's intersecting the side of untouched mountain, right? And it's coming down, it's coming down, it's coming down, it's coming down. Now, Javier?
Desmond.
Desmond has decided to cut an 80-foot trench in the side of that mountain. That means that this topo now extends up to this contour, comes across, and drops back down, and that's what describes your 80-foot excavation, your 80-foot deep regrading of the site.
Okay. Does that mean you have to extend the first line to the border, to the boundary line?
No. If you zoom in at where Kevin was drawing in this corner, you'll see that there's a tiny fragment of this topo that meets the edge of the, right there. There's the original topo.
Oh, okay, I see. Okay.
But it could have, but on this side it didn't.
Right, okay.
So that's new level ground. And then you just, as Kevin will show you, you just continue this process all the way up until you've created that condition of regrading all the way up the slope. And he's making an excellent drawing of it right now on the whiteboard.
Okay, if we think about this condition in section, this is the topo surface. Each of these dash lines are representative of that 40-foot elevation. And when it intersects where this 80-foot channel is going to be, taking up two of these lines, this topo line then has to continue up or down the length of the channel. So if we ended up looking at this sort of in projected space, this topo line continues until this point either goes up or down, and then this topo line rejoins with the rest of the topography. Does this little diagram make sense?
Other questions?
Clear. Kevin just explained is critical to this assignment.
So I'm not going to do that for every line, but you are going to do that for every line. And the final step is to, format the drawing. There's two steps to that. The first one is to interpolate an additional contour line between each of the existing contours so that the interval becomes 20 feet. This will facilitate the construction of the next model. But what does it mean by interpolate? Does anyone know what that might mean?
You're putting information in instead of trying to take information out.
Yes, we're adding more information into the drawing based on some information that's already there. Okay? There's a couple of ways that you could do this. I'm going to show you, I think, an easy method to do this, and my colleagues will tell me whether or not they prefer us to use that method or not. Okay?
Or we will. But I just, anybody who's multitasking right now, this would be an excellent moment to single task.
Okay. So if I want to then interpolate a 20-foot contour, I know that means that there's just going to be a line of some shape, some distance in between each of my existing contours. Okay? I'm gonna call it a quick and dirty method because that's what it's gonna end up looking like, and then there's a way of kind of massaging some accuracy into it, is by, let's say I'm looking at these two lines here, okay? If I want a topo line right in between, then what I'm going to do is measure the horizontal distance between them first. Well, the horizontal distance between them is not consistent. So what I want to do is kind of average that distance. So I'm going to use a distance command and measure a really long distance in between, right? This one says 385. This one says 459. And when we get closer together, let's say maybe over here, 287. Okay, so there's a range of measurements there. Okay, you can sort of in your head think about the same way that these lines come together, right? You want to think of that in more lines, more of a more measurements between just two topo lines. So that if I drew this new topo line through, let's say the midpoint, just for diagrammatic sake, if I drew those lines that I was measuring, if I drew a line that went through the midpoint of each of those all the way through, that would be a very rough estimate of about the distance away you would want this topo line to exist. Okay? Another way of being able to get more of the shape of how this line might look is to offset this existing topo line upwards by that average distance. Okay? So let's say if we selected this line and offset it, I could specify this distance not by typing in a number, but using some of these lines that I've actually drawn in. And I want it to offset from its origin to where I've drawn this kind of rough shape in. Okay? So that defines the distance, and then I click to make that offset. Okay. So then if I temporarily just hide this, I've got an interpolation of this representing one of the original elevations, this one representing 40 feet above that, and this one representing a 20-foot split in between those points. Okay? And I would do the same thing. I would extend these to the boundary. And by the time I get down to where my pulled topo intersects, I don't have to worry about regrading that particular topo line because it already has been, and it's interpolated information rather than continuing to try to intersect these offset lines. Okay. Does that method work for you guys?
I think that's a great method.
Yeah.
I like that method too.
Are there any questions about that process? Ultimately, I'm offsetting those topo lines by an average midpoint between it and the next topo line. And being clear to myself that in perhaps good file management should be contained on yet another layer. Interpolated topo with another color, one that we might not have used. I like color 8. Put that interpolated line on the corresponding layer. Okay. Ooh, this is an interesting.
Yeah.
So properties.
Yeah. So this line, its color doesn't come from the layer. Up until this point, everything that we put on a layer that is associated with a color has a display layer. But this one's not behaving, even though I know it's on the layer I want it to be on, because it's the active layer right here under this layer properties tab shows me that that's the layer that it's on. And if I type in properties, it also tells me what layer it's on. But the color doesn't say, what it should say is by layer. That means that when you change the layer properties, that's where this geometry is going to inherit its color from. So I need to click on this drop down and click on by layer. Okay?
Then of course you'd erase your lines that you use to create that averaged midpoint.
Correct. And then eventually when you turn all of these layers back on, you will have from plan view what appear to be collinear lines in space. From plan view, that's okay. At this point, it's completely okay. But you do need to be able to toggle your layer visibility on and off. Be very explicit with your layer management in terms of what you draw goes where. It has its own section of information, so that when everything is turned back on, it's a complete, accurate, and moving forward workable drawing.
And in fact, given that the layer color is correct on the layer properties manager, if we zoomed out, selected all, and made everything's color by layer, see how it says varies, color, everything should come up, still be up in the right color if it's on the right layer. But this way, once you do this, you have a visual check running all the time in your working environment about whether things are placed on the right layer or not. You can see the discrepancies if you work this way. And if you've ever had to take over someone else's file who did not keep their layer properties and layer assignations rigorously controlled, you know, you'll never want to work with that person who gave you the crappy file again. And if you're their boss, you'll probably not have them in your office very long.
And the corollary with that, if someone takes over your file and it's, as Richard described, you've got a real good chance of never working with it. Certainly not working very long in that firm.
That's right.
But these things are absolutely critical, and you're hearing it now. Take it forward.
Usually get a couple of days in a new office of this is how we manage our files and layers, and
Yeah.
in my experience, you get that. I know some
Yes,
places
Yeah.
but you better be struggling to adhere to the new standards, or because otherwise all you're doing is making more work for people around you to fix your mess.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
have a document. I create a document with all of the layers that I use, and it's like totally a requirement in my office. Everybody has to draw in that system.
So Lorena, I'm going to repeat loud for the people in the back. Lorena says they have a strictly followed written set of CAD standards for all the work in her office, and everybody is required to make sure that all the documents produced, all the digital data sets conform to those standards. And that's typical standard practice for any office. And there was a question back here.
I was going to ask if the interpolated line is going to be extended to the back.
Yes, it should be.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And,
that's-
and Kevin he would probably check it up on the top boundary to make sure it's not over the edge of the square too. And lo and behold, It's a miracle.
It's touching.
Yeah, it's a miracle.
Wow.
It's a Christmas miracle.
Mm.
But he checked. And then he's going to extend that.
I have a
If
question.
I
Another
wanted to be
question here.
absolutely sure whether this was touching or not, you know, I keep zooming in, keep zooming in, keep zooming in. What I can do is I can draw a sacrificial boundary just beyond, use that to extend this line to, and then go back and trim that line by the boundary that I need. Now I know that it stops right there.
Could you also offset the above line to the middle?
This one here?
The one above it, the other one?
This one here?
Below it, I guess. The
This one here?
What? One more?
This one here?
Yeah, can you offset that to get
Every single line on my topo needs to be offset.
Yeah, can you
He's
offset?
asking you to
Oh,
demonstrate.
can I
it.
do
No,
it?
no,
No.
can you offset that line to get the gray line too, instead of doing the one?
Oh, because I got this one from offsetting this
Right.
one this way?
Yeah.
Could I do it that way? Yeah, you could do it that way as
Does
well.
it matter?
It, but whether you're going or interpolating up or interpolating down, you should probably be consistent
Yes.
Yeah.
and either do them all interpolated up or all interpolated down.
Okay.
Okay, so that was the interpolation step, and then the last one is the drawing will be printed at. I'm not a fan of this nomenclature, but will be printed out at 1 inch equals 200 feet on a 20 inch by 20 inch sheet. Let me show you how to set that up. I'm going to click on either one of these layout tabs or create a new layout. And then if I go up to Output and Page Setup Manager, I can pick however many layouts I have here. And in this case, I'm working with layout 1. And right now, it's telling me that the plot size is 8.5 by 11 inches. I don't want that. I want 20 by 20. So I'm going to go to New. Oops, sorry. I'm going to click on Modify. And now my cat is frozen. Okay. And then under paper size, there's not going to be a 20 inch by 20 inch. So you're going to have to create a custom layout, which this interface is different for me.
You have to go to Properties.
Right.
There should be a custom there, custom sheet size. 2 down from the blue highlight.
Custom paper sizes.
Might have to go into Adobe PDF and create it. Damn it. But you could just put it on an arc D, couldn't you? Because we're going to trim to 20. So put it,
That's a good idea.
put it on an arc D, and then they don't have to create a custom sheet.
Okay. So arc D is the nomenclature for a 24 by 36. Okay. So that means if my final drawing is going to be 20 by 20, not only can I end up with a full bleed artifact, right? The ink goes to the edge of the paper. That's something that I can set up in my paper space so that I don't have kind of the default print square, right? That every printer has and kind of depends on what the printer is. So I've set up the paper size as Art D. Okay, and now I can see that my paper size has gotten much bigger and my viewport has gotten much smaller. But then what I'll have to do is say that I'm going to resize my viewport to 20 inches by 20 inches. Okay, what I like to do is just draw a rectangle in this space and here's an interesting issue that we're gonna have. Because I'm in decimal feet, I'm not gonna be able to type in 20 inches unless I calculate what decimal of a foot 20 inches should be, right? So, go ahead.
I think you could go back to modify and
Mhm.
set scale, and it would just center it on that 30 by 36, 24 by 36 sheet. So if you set that to,
I can make a custom scale, that's fine.
yeah,
Okay.
1 inch equals 200 feet. And then instead of, on the left, instead of doing layout, hit layout and go to window.
Yeah.
And then window your sheet from corner to corner. No, just window the sheet itself, the square. Sorry. Now I'm actually driving again. That's a fast mouse you have there, Kevin. Window. And you go from corner to corner. I stand corrected. So you have to be tricking on all space.
Mhm.
Sorry,
That's okay.
doesn't work.
Doesn't work.
To be able to draw that 20 inch by 20 inch, I can divide one. How would you do that? 1 divided by 20. I'm bad at math. Right, it would be 0.05 feet. How would you?
20 inches is
1
20
feet,
inches is what decimal of
1,
feet? 1 point something.
1.8, right?
1.8.
I think so.
yes,
1.6.
yes,
20 divided by 12.
yes.
1.6?
So I draw a rectangle
No.
that measures.
No, 1.6.
You know what?
No, 1.6 is.
Why don't we demonstrate plotting on Wednesday?
Okay.
Okay.
Let's do that,
Okay.
because they've already been sitting here for almost an hour and a half. And they're